Hello and happy Friday, Texas listeners. Welcome to our first Friday podcast. On Fridays, my goal is to have a little bit more of a casual kind of approach to things. And what I'm going to actually be doing is reacting to one of my least favorite places on earth, Reddit career crush, CS career questions. I generally avoid this like the plague. A lot of the advice is pretty terrible. So I'm going to be going through, finding some advice, and kind of reacting to it, giving you what I think is good, what I think is bad, and how we might improve on some of that less than great advice, and potentially even improve on some of the really good advice. So the very first thing that I found on CS career questions on Reddit is a resume advice thread. We have the advice to keep your resume on one page. So I've heard this debated back and forth again and again and again. And so my ultimate thought is, for the most part, keep it to one page, especially if you're early in career. There's just not enough to keep it really focused. And I think that's the main thing with the one page, is it forces you to be really focused and intentional on what you're including in your resume. You don't want a recruiter to be thinking like, what does this have to do with this job? So if you can fill one page, cool. If you can fill 2 pages, have somebody else double check to make sure that everything is relevant. But in general, later in career, the one page rule kind of isn't as strong. I know that it's debated even early career, but I've heard a lot of people say that it's really, really helpful. And the thing is, having done a decent number of resume reviews for students and new grads, especially going into Grace Hopper this year, I found that very, very few actually can justify more than one page. I've been in an industry at this point for about 1.5 years total. And I have also been volunteering with organizations in the technology space for over 10 years, and I still am able to fit all of my work into one page. So for the most part, if you're early career, you can too. So I do like the advice of sticking to that one page. Let's see what next advice we have. So a lot of people are just posting their resumes and asking for general advice in this thread, which can be helpful. But the thing is that crowdsourcing advice isn't necessarily that helpful. You don't know the quality of the advice you're going to be getting. So in general, I advise finding good resources that are written up on resumes and then actually following through on those. So almost every college has really good resume advice, especially available to their own students. I know Google has resume advice specific to their career sites. And so ultimately, like, do your research, find some of these resources, and also know that resume writing is an art. It's not a science. I've had my resume passed around to a bunch of people, and I literally have debates on the Google Docs of the notes from that resume review. So it's not a one size fits all. It's really something where everybody kind of has their own thoughts. So definitely be kind of cautious anytime that you're seeing people doing resume reviews and things like that of what are these people's backgrounds. I, for one, am just a software engineer. I've never actually reviewed a resume for an actual job. I have only dealt with my own resume, but I'm able to speak from the background of having received a ton of feedback from friends who include directors at Google. I've had 2 or 3 directors at this point review my resume at different points and give me feedback. I've had principal engineers at FANG companies. I've had friends who are senior engineers and managers at all sorts of tech companies of various sizes give me all sorts of feedback. And so, I'm able to just kind of share what I have gotten from all of those reviews. I am not explicitly like an expert myself, but it is important to know when talking online that a lot of these people, honestly, like, they're not experts, and I would take what they're giving you with a grain of salt. So, okay. We have a lot of people talking about as well what their experience is applying for jobs. So I have somebody saying that they've applied for 80 different jobs in the last 2 months. I've had somebody in here saying that they've applied to over 250 jobs in the last 10 months and have only received one interview in this thread. So when I applied for internships, and actually for new grad jobs, I actually kept a spreadsheet. And in that spreadsheet, I kept how many jobs I applied to, how many times I got coding assessments, how many times I got actual interviews, how many times I made it to final interview. It was definitely something that, like, to a certain degree was great. It's nice to look back on because I know exactly what it took for me to get where I am. But I also think that it can be really hard mentally to always make sure that you're staying with a decent mindset on it. So I'm trying to find that within my Google Drive right now to actually explain a little bit of what I've actually done. So when I applied for internships, I applied to 271 internships. Of those, I got ghosted by 105. And I know that I got ghosted because I never heard back from them, and it's been over 2 years. So we know that 105 of those ghosted me. I got 19 coding assessments and 20 interviews, all for 2 offers. So here's the thing. Unfortunately, times have gotten worse because then when I applied for new grad, I already had an internship. I had worked for IBM for 7 months. I applied for 123 jobs. I had 68 ghost me. I had 7 assessments and 11 interviews. And so some of it is, it's really easy to just look at the numbers and get really, really down on it. And I've been there. I've felt that. To a certain degree, you need to double check, like, how fast are you getting rejected? Are you making it to the assessments? Because my count on assessments, my percentage of assessments greatly increased in proportion to the number of jobs I actually applied to, my assessments and my interviews. And so, like, if you're not making it to assessments, you need to look at what is up before. Like, usually your format of your resume isn't the problem. Usually it's what's actually contained in your resume. So one of the things that's really, really important for people to remember is that right now the tech industry is pretty flooded with new talent, and that can be pretty challenging to break into. And so you're going to have a ton of new grads and a ton of early career people who are just trying to break into this industry. And the thing is, how are you going to set yourself apart? If you're not getting to the assessment phase, you're not setting yourself apart enough. So you need to look at not just the format of your resume, because I think a lot of people, myself included, find it really easy to get caught up in, oh, I must not be displaying my skills well enough, instead of asking, do I have the skills that are going to make me desirable as a hire? And that's a really, really hard question to wind up having to ask, but it's so, so, so important, because if you just keep on refining your resume, but you're not adding new projects, you're not adding new learning, you're just going to continue to apply and have the same results. And so, like, if you're applying a ton of places and you're seeing nothing, you need to start looking at what are some of the things? See if you can find some people who are in industry, who are in those jobs similar to what you're applying to, and ask them if you can see their resumes. Because like I happily would show people my resume if they wanted to see what it took for me to get my job at Boeing. What did my resume look like when I got hired? Because the thing is that often there's gaps that people don't realize that they have, and you want to acquire those skills. So, ultimately at this point in time, simply being a software engineer is often not necessarily enough. More and more new grads are going and graduating with some sort of specialization. I graduated with a bit of a specialization in cybersecurity. Even though my degree is in computer science, I did a ton of cybersecurity competitions. And so I graduated as not just a software engineer, but a software engineer specifically focused on secure systems. And then from there, I struggled initially. It took me about 3 months after I graduated to get my job lined up. And during that time, I focused on learning machine learning. And I made sure that my resume continued to improve, and not just the formatting. So that's one thing that like a lot of these advice threads on like Reddit and things like that focus in on a lot is, oh, do you have enough white space? Do you have one page? But don't get lost in the fluff in the presentation of the resume on what the meat of the resume is supposed to be. So ultimately, I also made it to a ton more interviews in proportion when I applied for new grad roles versus internships. And a lot of that is also due to me having had a co-op for a period of time at a tech company working in tech, but then also just that I was constantly learning new skills and my resume showed it. And so a lot of companies really knew that if you looked at me, I was going to be able to keep up with the times. So definitely one of the things when people are saying how many jobs they've applied to, have you changed your tactic once you start to get to that many applications? Because at a certain point, you are wasting your time if you're not changing something. It's clearly not working if you're applying to 250 jobs and getting one interview. What are you changing? And I know that that's like easy to say as somebody who currently has a job, but simultaneously, like there were so many days that I was in tears for not having a job when I graduated. That was not my life plan. I am as type A as they get. And I understand that it's really hard to hear that whatever you've done thus far isn't working. But definitely make sure that you're kind of keeping a finger on it. Keep a finger on that pulse on, okay, have I applied to enough places that I'm starting to get a little disheartened? If so, change it up. Find an online course for free you're interested in. Find a side project you're interested in. Find open source that you want to contribute to. Do something. Keep new technologies being brought into your resume constantly, and then update your resume and see if you have a little bit more luck at that point. Some of it is ultimately luck. So one person said in this thread as well, they're not sure how they're supposed to put the skills or where they're supposed to put the skills that they have as a software developer as far as their resume. So one thing that I saw a lot when reviewing resumes for Grace Hopper is I saw a lot of people putting their skills towards the bottom, like in the bottom quarter probably of their resume, not at the very, very bottom, but second to last section. I would highly advise against that personally, because what you want your resume to do is to make the job of the recruiter as easy as possible for them to know that you know what you're doing and that you're the right fit for their job. And that's a lot easier to do if they're able to just immediately skim and see the skills that you have. One of the pieces of advice that I got while doing one of the resume reviews that I've had that I really liked and implemented, and I really like to see, especially in students who are early career, is actually breaking out how comfortable you are with each technical skill. So I have languages that I learned in college, that I learned early in my degree, that I definitely could learn faster than somebody who's never used them before, but that I'm not as comfortable in as the languages that I use every day at work. And so for those, I put that I have prior experience. And then I have some that I have, I believe, comfortable as the terminology that I use. And then I have some that I explain that I am proficient in. And that way, yes, any of them could get asked about in an interview, but it's a little bit more understandable if I don't work in C++ every day, but I have used it, if I maybe don't know exactly the newest technology on C++, but I can still explain what a pointer is. So like, make sure that you're not including things that you're not comfortable with at all, because at that point, they don't help you. But also, it's okay to include things that you're learning, or I just highly advise that you clarify that in some way, shape, or form. And then I personally believe that skills should be at the top of the resume. As soon as you have the contact information, have your skills, because that's ultimately one of the main things that they're hiring you for. So make that really, really, really easy to find. A common question is, if you have a side job, especially while you're in college, such as a cashier role or a different service industry role or something else completely unrelated to what you're trying to do in tech, do you include it on your resume? So I would say no, for the most part. So ultimately, you don't want a half-page resume. It looks like you didn't put in effort. So if you cannot fill out your resume with projects and clubs and anything else you did, and make it one page, yes, include those side jobs, and then focus in on the skills that actually are transferable. So for instance, for a cashier role, one of the things that cashiers are usually really good at is actually like working under pressure, which is something that happens in engineering all the time. If you're in the service industry and you're working as like a waiter, you're often used to dealing with a little bit vague questions and things like that from customers, and they expect you to just know the answer. And we don't always get 100% of the information we want when dealing with problem statements. So there are skills that are incredibly useful that you get in those jobs. And if you don't have enough that's directly transferable, you want to put forth a little bit of extra effort to make sure that whatever background you're coming from, that it's clear why you included that. So for me, I don't currently have it on my resume. At this point, I have like enough directly tech related work to not include it, but I used to work in education. And so for me, one of the things that I would have focused in on is that I'm really good at communication and I'm really good at leading people. And I can also communicate really technical concepts really simply. And so I would focus in my background on education on those skills, because those skills are still useful in tech. But if you can fill a whole page with just projects and school and clubs that are relevant and things like that, I personally would say that that's probably a better move in general. But if you can't fill a page with those things, fill out the page with the rest of your experience, and then just focus in what skill sets are useful. Another piece of advice that's coming up a lot is the mentioning of skills within the bullet points of projects and things like that, but not including them in the skills section of your resume. You want to include both. So every time that a skill set is mentioned in my resume, it will be both on the skills section at the top of my resume and mentioned somewhere in a bullet point within my resume, or potentially on my LinkedIn as a bullet point if I do not have room on my resume. I personally leverage my LinkedIn as an extension of my resume. I don't have one-page rule there. I assume people are going to spend a little bit more time on my LinkedIn, so I'm comfortable elaborating a little bit more on there. But for the most part, your bullet points on your resume within projects and things like that should include different libraries that you're used to, different programming languages you're used to, different skill sets that you're able to use. different kind of problem sets that you're able to solve. And you want to include those in your skills as well. It should be in both. Okay. Cover letters. Oh, the cover letter. So I am going to say that I don't, at this point in my life, use cover letters. I don't find that they're often that helpful within the tech industry for somebody like me who has a very clear defined path for it. If you're going for more of a niche role, or you're coming without a computer science degree or something like that, they can be helpful to kind of bridge the YU kind of gaps. But in general, I personally don't use them, and I've had plenty of luck with plenty of companies without them. And yeah, I just don't think that they add that much. Okay, so let's talk through somebody's resume. I'm not going to give any of the information about them, but we're going to talk through what their resume has. So, very top, we have their name, their contact information, and this person included a photo. Do not include a photo. Don't do it. It basically sets people up to be in a liability territory, and in general, it does nothing good. We don't want to include things that can't possibly help us. And a photo is definitely that. So I would say scratch the photo. From there, we have the technical skills. And then we have, they decided to categorize based on languages, web frameworks and databases, server containerization, version control, et cetera, et cetera. These things can be helpful, but I think that it's still more helpful to have your experience and comfort level be the prioritization on this, because they have like C and Python and Java and JavaScript. Those are 4 very different languages. And if I was an interviewer and I wanted to ask them a question about C, for all I know, they did a project in C several years ago, and they know it better than having never worked with it before, but maybe they're more comfortable in Python, and I would have no idea. And so also it winds up being that the more you break it down into these categories, the more white space you wind up adding. And you want to be cautious on white space because you want things to be legible and like really quickly readable, but you don't want to basically waste your space. That's one of the things that, like, when we talk 1-page resumes, that's one of the things, it's just using that space well. And so often breaking them down into things like languages and then containerization and then version control, it's just not, that level of detail is not needed. They then put their work experience because they graduated several years ago. So their education is under their work experience. That makes sense. If you have graduated in the last year or so, have your education above your work experience. But as soon as you get a full-time job after graduation, move work experience on top of education. They have 4 different companies and titles of software engineer, all of them, and then have really nice little bullet points on what they did. So one of the things, though, that is unclear is they said focus on backend development operations within cable division at company A and supported project by improving data provisioning, creating, managing, in maintaining new and existing APIs, overseeing maintenance, in implementing microservices architecture, all archived through utilization of Java and Spring Boot. What do they mean by focusing on those things? Are they responsible for leading a team that does this? Are they doing this by themselves? You want to be really, really clear in these bullet points on what did you do? You want basically that bullet point to leave a very clear image in the person who's reading it's head of what role you played within it. Another thing that a lot of people fall into, that this person has fallen into, is they start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 out of 10 bullet points with developed. Open a thesaurus if you need to. But also, developed doesn't usually tell me enough information. Did you design it as well? What is your role? Did you write all of the code solo? Did you write which pieces of that code? But also, it just have more diversity in your bullet points. It's a simple thing. I personally don't update my resume for every single job I apply to. I keep one really solid resume, and that's been highly effective for me. And so, just put in the time and energy up front. From there, we have their school, and they don't include a GPA. So here's a fun fact about me. I went to a school that doesn't have a GPA. So I'm a total fan of not including your GPA. And in general, the advice that I have heard is anything lower than a 3.75, you should leave off your resume. At the end of the day, a degree is a degree. So, don't feel ashamed of not including your GPA. I made it to tons of FANG interviews without even having a GPA. So it's fine. It will not destroy your odds. Then they say on there that they're working on a master's degree and they're close to completion. That doesn't tell me enough. I want to know when they're graduating, what month, what year. I want to know at the very least what season, because if they're working full time while getting their master's degree, that's one thing. But if they're taking a pause to pursue their master's degree, I want to know when they're available to work for me full time. And then we have projects. Nice, simple. They do include their work authorization at the bottom, which I don't personally like, because quite frankly, you should have. I just don't think it's necessary. Everybody asks anyway. That should be an early piece of conversation. I consider it a red flag if a company doesn't communicate that with me early on. Because while I don't need work authorization, I don't want to work for places that are disrespectful of the time of people who do need work authorization. And that should be part of the early conversation for them. So I would never even consider including that in my resume. And I wouldn't appreciate any company who couldn't have that be an important part of the conversation, because it's so important to such a big portion of people. And it's just the considerate thing to do to make sure that that's an early conversation piece. So nothing super sketchy, just doing like a 30-minute skim through of this resume advice thread. But I am confident we will find some more sketch advice in the future. Hopefully some of this was at least helpful. In general, Fridays are going to be just a little more chill after a whole week of work and things like that. And so we'll just be going through, finding some advice threads or finding some people saying things about the tech industry. And I'll be giving you guys my thoughts on that and how accurate or inaccurate these things are. So thank you for joining me today on kind of a casual Friday. And I hope you have a great weekend. Bye.